You are listening to Personalization Outbreak, a podcast about the collapse of traditional corporate standards in today's more personalized world. I'm Glenn Yopes. I'm a leadership strategist, author, contributor to Forbes, and founder of the Leadership in the Age of Personalization movement. On this show, I'm interviewing executives across multiple sectors to find out how the balance between standardization and personalization can exist. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Personalization Outbreak Podcast, where we reimagine leadership one conversation at a time. Now, in today's episode, we're going to be talking about a topic that truly resonates deeply in boardrooms, communities, and societies alike. Why do some of the biggest challenges we face? I want everyone to think about this. Challenges like geopolitical conflicts, immigration struggles, even the state of our healthcare system. Why do these things continue to linger? Despite our best efforts, these issues resist resolution, often revealing one painful truth. The leadership models we've relied on for decades are no longer enough. And today, I'm joined by two experts from Babson College whose work shines a light on what leadership can look like when we dare to do things differently. First, we have Dana Greenberg, the Walter H. Carpenter Professor of Organizational Behavior. Now, Dana's research focuses on entrepreneurship education, learning, as well as the integration of work and life. Now, in both areas, she centers on how we can reimagine leadership in organizational design so that employees can thrive professionally and personally. Also joining us is Scott Taylor, Professor of Organizational Behavior at the Arthur M. Blank Endowed Chair of Values-Based Leadership at the Blank School at Babson College. Now, Scott's research centers on leader assessment and development shaped by his extensive work with organizations around the globe. Now, outdated approaches to leadership are making way for new models, and boy, do we all know that we need them. But it's less about authority now and more about relationships, innovation, and authenticity. Now, today, Dana and Scott will explore how a shift towards relational and entrepreneurial leadership builds stronger teams, leads to better outcomes for employees, and creates a culture that thrives on trust and care. So before we get started, please click the like button below, share it with your colleagues, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and social media at Glenn Yopes. Dana and Scott, welcome to the show. After that introduction, I think people are expecting a lot.
Well, we'll hope between the three of us that we'll be able to deliver a lot. And thank you so much for having us. We're looking forward to the conversation.
Well, Dana, I think that as we've discussed before, and Scott as well, we're dealing with a leadership crisis. And I think that there's a lot of people that say that, but they don't really know what that crisis is. So, Scott, why don't you take a shot at it? And maybe if you could boil it down to one sentence, what is the leadership crisis?
I think it boils down to the fact that we are trying to do too much as individuals. And we have extraordinary expectations on the individual. And as you led off with your introduction, leadership is making a dramatic and important and necessary shift to the relational.
So too much individual needs to more relational. Dana, why do you think we've reached that point?
I think we've reached that point because of the situation that you outlined in your introduction. When you talk about these grand challenges, you said, right? So think about geopolitical climate, economic uncertainty, climate change. None of these situations, healthcare, are dependent upon what any one individual knows. So when we think about the healthcare crisis, for example, in the United States, it's not going to be solved by the doctors. It's not going to be solved by the politicians. It's not going to be solved by the healthcare providers. And it's not going to be solved alone by management scholars and entrepreneurs who are coming up with new and innovative approaches, right? And we've historically, this individual approach prioritizes one person's knowledge over the other. And to solve these kinds of problems today, we can't depend on any one individual's knowledge. All of those folks have to come together to work together to appreciate what each one is bringing to the table to solve these kinds of problems. So I think the ramp up of the complexity of problems, the multi or interdisciplinary nature of problem solving today is really pushing forward this idea of leadership being relationally oriented and not individually based.
So let's take a step back. How did we get to this point where we forgot about the values of being much more inclusive and relational? What do you think, Dana?
So I think I would go back to the 80s. So in the 80s, we started with lots of myths about this larger than life individual, charismatic, transformational
Hmm.
individual, and I'll say typically male leader, right? So we talked for years in the early 80s about Jack Welch and GE, and we taught about it in the business schools and in management education. And I think that conversation propelled this idea of a singular focus on one person at a senior level,
Mm.
takes full responsibility for leading the organization forward. And as we saw, that could work for a short period of time, but the moment the organization hits any kind of turbulence in the environment or significant uncertainty, that singular model no longer works. And so that's requiring us to think differently about leadership.
Okay, thank you so much for that clarification because when we said it was too much on the individual and more relational, I want to make sure that where did this individual come from? So there was too much focus on power in one person at the top that drove everything that happened in the organization. And now we need more of a relational type of leadership model. So I have to ask this question, and guys, I'm just trying to set it up a little differently now that you went there, is how does this even begin when these models were always designed by hierarchy and rank? How do you start breaking down the hierarchical if we're going to be more relational? Who wants to take a shot at that?
Well, I'll comment first. First of all, I think what Dan is well describing is the myth of the hero leader, as folks have written about it. You can't just stand on top of a mountain and kind of be the hero for everybody in this day and age, and given the complexity. And so you start to break it down when it's not just about bringing people together, because we've done that in a lot of situations over the years in different organizing. It's the way in which they come together, and it's
Mm.
the way in which they build those connections that are resonant, that are innovative, that are creative. And so it's not just bringing a people together. We have in government many committees and subcommittees that come together. But what is the process, or what are the ways in which they're engaging? What's the level of trust? What's the level of sense of inclusion? What's the level of sense of belonging? To what degree are my ideas listened to and valued? And so it's the nature of how we come together. The other piece that's essential to breaking it down is incorporating what we've learned from new science into the models of leadership.
Mm.
Unfortunately, we have too many models that have been around a long period of time and are ignoring much of what we've learned about human performance, about the importance of emotion, about the importance of how we think, and the implications emotions have on how we think. And so, a positive climate has significant impact on human performance compared to a negative climate.
Yep.
But yet, a lot of that new science, including neuroscience, has not proliferated into the models of leadership. And where they have, they're starting putting into question some of the assumptions we've made about how people perform at their best, what brings out their best, what drives creativity and innovation. So as that new science comes in, as we start to come together in a different way,
Mm.
you start to break down some of that hierarchy, some of that tradition.
That's excellent, Scott. Now, you also say that it's not just relational, but also an entrepreneurial approach. Help us understand that a little bit more, Dana, this entrepreneurial approach, and how does that tie into the relational approach?
Absolutely. So we always say it's a foundation of two pieces, the relational aspect, but also having this entrepreneurial mindset. And when we talk about an entrepreneurial mindset, it's about having the ability to attend to risks, to act your way into a situation, to be afraid to take a chance with a group of people or to tackle a problem where there's really an unknown answer in front of you. Too often, when leaders set out direction, they're doing it in a very structured, planned, what we might call a traditional waterfall kind of approach, right? I want to get to X goal, and I'm going to lay out a way to get there. But if we're thinking about entrepreneurial, we're saying we don't know exactly what the goal is. We don't know what the end point is going to look like. And so to get there, we have to be more action oriented. We have to be more comfortable taking chances, trying something out, learning from that experience, and bringing it back to the team and making another action. And that's why the relational is so important, because that kind of an entrepreneurial approach you can't do as an individual. You do best when you do it with a group of a team of people who really trust each other and can take action and can learn from one another's action to inform the next action and move forward in that way.
So how do you get an employee? Let me lay this out. They've come into an organization, they've been given the playbook, they're rewarded to follow that playbook, and they do what they know. They do what they're told to do inside the box they're given. They've been conditioned to believe that if they do it a different way, there is risk rather than opportunity. How do you shift that mindset of that employee or that leader that's been doing it that way for so long? Because look, I'm I'm very interested in the ways that you're thinking to disrupt the model, and I actually think this is the model. But how do you get people there when they've been doing it the wrong way for so long?
Yeah, I could jump in on that one. I'll give a practical example and then broaden what I'm saying. Let's assume, Glenn, you're a new hire. You come in, you've been experienced elsewhere. So you're not just coming at it without any experience. If I, as a supervisor or manager, sit down with you and say, Glenn, you've got great experience. That's why we're so excited you're here. I fully expect that when you kind of on board here, you're going to see things and go, why in the world are we doing it that way here? We did it differently over there. And I think you're going to have some creative thoughts and insights about that, where you're trying to reconcile your prior experience with this current experience. And some of that's going to be new ideas
Mhm.
because of this convergence. I want to sit down with you every 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and just go through your notes about that. What are you thinking? What are you experiencing? What insights are you having? Because you've got what I would call newcomer knowledge that's going to be very insightful. Now, some of this I may say, hey, here's a little bit of history to explain that. But other ideas, I'm going to go, you know what? We haven't considered that. We ought to explore that with the whole team. That's a very different approach to your onboarding as opposed to I need to socialize you to the way we do things here. Here are the rules. No, I'm giving you some autonomy to think outside the box, expecting that you'll have that experience. We've got great research that says newcomers do have those experiences when they onboard to an organization. I'm also giving you license to grow that capability of thinking and innovating. And I'm also trying to build that trust between you and I. I want you to share that with me. Those three things, those three aspects, the autonomy, the competence that you're going to start to feel, and the support in terms of relational, drive the intrinsic motivation, not just the extrinsic. I'm going to give you some pay and some benefits to be a part of this organization. And we know that that intrinsic motivation will drive higher performance from you that'll benefit all of us, including you, in a collective way than just pay and benefits.
I'd add on the second key action I take is sort of when we think about sort of what are leaders doing to cultivate this, right? What do you do at the start, that onboarding?
Mhm.
But what do you do in process when those employees are off doing things and making mistakes, right? Because we know if we give our employees more autonomy, if we have them bring in more creative ideas, more of these big ideas that they have, they're more likely to have some mistakes, right? And so how do you correct as a leader when those mistakes happen, right? How do you help employees reset? And Scott mentioned this idea of autonomy. The biggest mistake leaders can make is take things away from employees when a mistake happens, or to say to them, you did it wrong, you should have done it this way, right? Rather than a mistake happens, how do you coach the employee through that? How do you help them problem solve? How do you help them figure out, okay, well, that didn't go the way you thought, but what did you learn in the process? How can you take that information forward? Who else can we get engaged? And so in that way, if mistakes happen in more of this entrepreneurial process, how do you help continue to build that idea of autonomy and making an employee feel they've got a lot of confidence in this and they can continue to engage with you in this entrepreneurial way?
Well, what I just heard you say is you're disrupting the entire system because this is going to require every leader to exemplify the behaviors and approaches that both of you just described. So
Very
how do
much
you
so.
so how do you build that consistency across an organization where leaders have always, well, not always, but most of the time have expected things to be done their way? I mean, isn't there a level of vulnerability that maybe leaders aren't prepared for yet? And by the way, I see this as an opportunity for growth for them based upon the way you're describing it.
Yeah, well, first of all is we have to rethink what is the nature of what we're trying to do here. And the reality is to go back to what you start, we're trying to solve and deal with and create possibilities and solve very complex challenges. And so I've got to let loose a little bit on the reins of control. And, when I talk to leaders about this in organizations, they don't get it, like you're saying, often in the workplace. But if you switch context and say, well, hey, many of you have people who are dependent on you outside of work. You may have children, you may have nieces and nephews, you may have volunteer organizations where you're contributing to youth. What do you do in that context? And all of a sudden they go, well, yeah, that's right. I don't take that approach because I get resistance and I get rejection. And yet they're doing it well outside of the work context. So part of the myth is that there isn't any integration between how I'm leading and behaving and trying to influence in a volunteer organization or with my own teenagers as opposed to what I'm doing in the workplace. So sometimes that really helps leaders go, wait a minute, I can do some of this and get confidence in allowing my people to make little mistakes and to learn how to learn from failure and to be more resilient. They seem to be able to do that in some contexts out of work. It's just in the workplace, we think, oh, no, that's not allowed here. And we've got to debunk that.
So doesn't this have to do with the role that caring plays in successful leadership? Dana, why don't you jump into that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I'd start out by saying the role of caring, I think one of the things about the word care is when we think about the word care, we often think of it in this very parental kind of way,
Hmm.
that I take care of you or that I am caring for you. And when we're thinking about the idea of care in this context, we're really thinking about it in terms of empathy, right? What does it mean that I am seeing you, Glenn, for example, as a whole person? And thinking about what is the range of skills and expertise that you are bringing into the workplace that we could draw upon. As Scott talks about that new knowledge, those may be professional experiences, but they may be personal experiences as well. So
Mhm.
one part of care is seeing you as a whole person. One part of care is being empathetic and attentive to who you are, what you need, and what your ideas are, and how do I bring those into the workplace. And a third piece of care is what do we do when we don't agree? Because the idea of being an entrepreneurial leader is about taking risks, trying new things, and tackling big problems. And to do that, that means I hope there are going to be a lot of times we're going to disagree. We're going to come at things from radically different perspectives.
Mhm.
But if we start from a position of care, then we're asking questions of tackling that problem rather than tackling the people. And so care is really then about how we interact and engage with each other as we problem solve and as we deal with conflicts and disagreements.
Guys, as I carefully listen to both of you, it seems to me that identity plays a big role in this. Am I capturing that properly? Where does
Yeah,
that come into play?
yeah, absolutely. Because in our model of entrepreneurial leadership, it starts with the leader, him or herself, right? Who am I? What do I want? What are my aspirations? Not just in terms of goals, but even in terms of who I want to become and what I want to accomplish. What brings meaning and purpose? What are my values? What are my strengths? What are my limitations? where do I, what are my superpowers versus, the challenges that kind of see me step back and be hesitant. Knowing about yourself is pivotal because if I don't have that internal clarity, it's really hard to focus outward. And we know that outstanding leaders have an outward focus. They're inner directed by that awareness, but they're outward focused. And so identity is huge in that because clarity on my identifiers about how I see myself and what I'm trying to do allows me then to focus outward and be attentive and empathetic in the way that Dan is describing. On the other hand, we know when you've got this internal noise, a lack of clarity, or you're abandoning what you espouse as to yourself as what's important and what you value, then we get drawn inward emotionally and cognitively, and we're impaired in demonstrating empathy. We're impaired in understanding other people. We're less receptive to ideas. We're less receptive to feedback from other people. And so, yeah, you're right, Glenn. Identity's huge in this.
I mean, the way I see this is if you don't know who you are, and if everybody else, from a relational perspective, they don't know who we are, then they don't know what to expect. And
That's right.
so, almost the entrepreneurial side of things, if that's what people are attempting to implement, almost becomes forced or over manufactured when we understand one another's identities, then things can go into a level of flow. Am I getting it?
Yeah, that's right. Dan, go ahead.
And I was going to say, and Scott, one of the things to notice about what Scott was talking about in terms of identity is he was saying things like, what do I hope to accomplish,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
What do I want to achieve? What do I want to impact here? And so when we're talking about what I understand about myself, professional identity no longer becomes what is the next title I want?
Exactly.
But what is it I want my impact to be? What is my story and the accomplishments and the challenges that I am going to solve with this team? And that is in itself a change too for people, right? How do we define ourselves and our professional sides of ourselves, not by what my title is or where I work, but more about what is the impact I am having on the organization and our objectives and our goals and the people I work with.
So, how are all these things measured? I mean, how do you see the disruption of performance management systems and all this? I'm sure you've studied that.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you still have to account for performance, but I think once you get a relational level that we're describing, actually becomes easier because now I can couch my feedback, my performance evaluation in the context of your aspirations, right?
Mm,
So, yeah, if I know enough, as you become clear on what aspects of your identity are, you become more fluid in sharing that. And as a leader, a manager, a supervisor, become clear on those aspirations of my people, what their developmental goals are, what they want to achieve, not just in the short term, but even in as you think long term, what we refer to in psychology as their ideal self, what their
mm.
aspirations are to become and to do. Well, then that allows me to calibrate that against what I see happening in the workplace. I know you're trying to achieve this. Here's where I see an opportunity to help, or let me give you some feedback on that. That becomes much more motivational to you because now it's couched in you understanding what I'm trying to do, both short term and long term, and who I'm trying to become. And I can support that. And I can also be a feedback source to help you get there.
Do you see a time, guys, where when it comes to performance, that people are going to have to become more self-directed? I mean, because it seems like the entrepreneurial nature is to be more self-directed.
Well, I'll give you the blue sky perspective. I'm actually writing a paper on this right now about the assumptions we make about accountability in the workplace.
Hmm.
And often that literature is very clear, the research literature, that accountability is can be easily punitive, judgmental, highly evaluative.
Hmm.
And yet maybe it's just because I'm getting older, but I think of my committed long-term relationships in and outside of my profession. I don't go home at night and hold my wife accountable or vice versa. I mean, we've been married almost 30 years. And yet, this is an evolving developmental relationship that I think we're becoming more effective and productive in our contributions in our professions, in our family, and what we offer. And so, yes, I think the more that we develop the type of workplace relationships we're talking about, self-accountability goes up, but also this notion of it's in relation to the other as well. It's not because self-accountability can become separate and fragmented from the rest. And so what we're writing about is relational accountability in a way that as you build these connections, as you build this caring, this empathy, as you're striving to support one another and each other's goals and aspirations, a level of accountability emerges that's very, very generative in nature rather than degenerative.
And Dana, what do you see the risk of this model? What's the risk?
That's a great question, Glenn. What is the risk of this model? Um, I think the risks of the model are trying to get organizations as a whole to buy into this.
Yeah,
That would
yeah,
be for me the risk, right? One of the things, this is a lot of how we actually teach at Babson. So when we think about our undergraduate students, we don't think about entrepreneurial leadership. For us, it is not connected to a title. It is about how I, as an individual, approach all aspects of my
yes,
work. And so we really work hard with from our undergraduates to our MBAs to the executive education we do, introducing these ideas to individuals and say, you can engage in entrepreneurial leadership at any level. And we do hear back from people, I am trying to do this, but it doesn't fit within my organizational system, right?
yeah,
Or
yeah,
people around me won't engage. So you were talking before about this idea of evaluation and where does
yeah,
evaluation fit in? Well, the problem with our evaluation systems in the United States, at least, is they're entirely individually based, right? We don't ask people about like, what accomplishments have you done as part of a group and give them and reward them for the fact that they were doing that in a relational system? Or what mistakes did you make this year and what did you learn from that? And how did you bring that forward in the team? Everything is about my individual achievement.
yeah.
And so organizational systems aren't set up to support people who are trying to do this. So it does require more extensive change at the organizational level. And we know that's hard to do.
No, Dana, first of all, thanks for letting me ask the question. But I did for what reason? First of all, I had a sense that you were going to say that, and I wanted to double click on this. Tactically, was my interpretation? And I'm dealing with this right now with a large healthcare system. If the board doesn't understand the value because they've only seen what leadership can be based upon their experience of the last 30 years, well, then, Dana, this represents too much risk. This is the point, right? Is if we have organizations who have very linear ways of thinking, a buy-in, let alone adoption, is very hard. And even when you do get the buy-in to adopt, well, the leaders that have known how to lead in the old models, they see this over time, or could see this over time, and I've seen it with the work that I do, as a threat, not an opportunity. Because rather than embrace something that's going to put you in a position to evolve, they think more about what it means to them as an individual rather than the whole benefit for the organization. And so that's what I took away from that. I don't know if you want to either push back or add to what I'm sharing, because I just want to make sure that our listeners and viewers realize that this is not easy. But why isn't it easy? Because we're in catch up mode. These things should have happened years ago. And so when you look at the baseline, if the baseline for growth is zero, this is where a lot of people and organizations feel, where they want to admit it or not, they're at like negative 60 because we're catching up. And so my point is this: whether people want full buy in or not, there has to be some level of adoption, because this is where things are going. And if they don't, no one's going to want to work for your organization. So, anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in because I really appreciate you just being honest. And I agree with you, Dan, if you can't get that buy in. But then again, we can't always wait for buy in to do what's right.
Yeah,
Scott?
there's two red flags I think Dad I would raise in reference to what you're saying. One is, look, the younger employees and the future of your organization have no tolerance for these old models.
Exactly.
They'll leave and go create their organization. They'll be innovative and creative elsewhere. The other is the one that we kicked off the session with, which is, look, we've got these long-standing problems. They're not unsolvable. It's just the models that we're applying to solve them aren't helpful. And so we're at a point now with some of these challenges that you can't avoid them any longer. We're
Exactly.
at a tipping point where either they're going to fragment and fray society in different ways and organizations within them, or we're going to come together in a way that's going to help us collectively move the dial. So you have both the pressing need that's at a point now, I think, in many cases where you can't ignore it, and then you've got kind of the bottom up, if you will, the future of leaders within societies have a very different perspective of what they want out of work and life, and they're going to find it, and it may not be in your organization unless you start to pivot.
Well, so I've got a question, and again, you guys can pass because we didn't discuss this one in advance, but I think it's worth at least exploring. But everything you just said there is why we're seeing a continued decline in trust in institutions. Okay, so people, I mean, those who are listening, this is what, when we don't do these kind of things, we start seeing trust erode. But the biggest thing that I've always encountered, and I'd love to just get any point of view on this, is how do you create the financial benefits of this? And I've always said, to keep it really simple, you may see a little decline before it takes off. But I think that this is just course correcting things that have been done in an archaic way where you're going to maybe have to slip a little bit before it really you see the hockey puck. Any thoughts on the financial side of implications of this model?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll just kick it off. We have prior precedent. Jeffrey Pfeffers at Stanford University wrote a book, I believe in 1995, called The Human Equation.
Hmm.
And it was different than this kind of classic good to great that took a snapshot in time. His question, Pfeffer's question was, what about those organizations that seem to be able to sustain their success over time? One of the best places to work for, what do they have in common? And if you go back to that kind of classic now 30 years, is it 30? Yeah, 30 years later, you're going to find many of the elements we're talking about,
Hmm.
where employees were treated as humans, not as objects, vehicles, or a means to an end. They weren't, they were rewarded well. There was very little status differences between the CEO and the general employee. They tried to eliminate those. There was a culture of valuing the human component that we each bring. And the list goes on. He had several criteria that he kept finding again and again in these organizations. That was a snapshot in time. Those organizations like Southwest and others were admired, etc. But it didn't catch on because you had the inertia of tradition. Well, now the context 30 years later is very different.
Mhm.
And it's not a nice to have, it's an absolute must have.
And when I think about what you were sharing, Scott, what I've seen at the at the most fundamental level of the financial benefits, recruitment, retention, and the increase in quality of decision making.
Yeah.
Well, and even your
Dan?
healthcare cost, right?
Yeah, right.
Because the level of stress and illness and all that absenteeism is a price.
Well, I think that's the price what we still don't know yet.
Yeah.
I think that's coming. That's coming next. But go ahead, Danny. You had something to say.
Yeah, no, I was going to jump in and given my background years ago in
Yes.
talent management, those are the things we really don't measure. So when we're thinking about the financial impact, which you were talking about, right? The number one thing the CFO is looking for is like, well, what's the financial benefit? What's the new initiative that we've introduced? What is the new product or services? And how rapidly are we bringing it to market, right? But we don't have a good way of measuring all of that human cost that Scott's been talking about. And that's the other part of this financial. If we can reduce those costs, that also has significant benefit, both short term, but really in the long term, right? If we're enabling people to feel comfortable bringing lots of initiatives, lots of new ideas, enabling them to try those out and test those out with the organization, they're not all going to land, right? but they are going to contribute to the big, bold new ideas that organizations need to be thinking about. None of them work. We talked about the world 20 or 30 years ago. None of us are working in a world that looks like it was 30 or 40 years ago. We know every year there is something that is disrupting every single industry, every single organization out there. We live in the world of higher ed. Right? We were probably the biggest dinosaur out there where we said, our world is very consistent and very constant. And even in higher ed, we're seeing this today. If organizations and higher education institutions aren't starting to think entrepreneurially about their future, they won't exist in another 20 to 30 years.
So do you think that part of what you just said, Dana, has a lot to do with why most people are in the wrong roles at work? Because go ahead, go ahead.
No, expand more on your question. What do you
Sure,
mean?
sure. Because again, when I see what this model represents, which is very similar to the one that I do with organizations, we often find that most people are in the wrong roles. In other words, they have the wrong job. They're not because they were put into that job because that's what their history, their resume showed. I'll give you an example. There was an individual that was a finance person for 12 years. And then she learned about what her identity is and then her ability to navigate and solve and act on the right opportunities. And she said to herself, wait a second, I want to be in ESG, environmental, social, and governance. But my employer says that I'm not qualified for that because they see me as a finance person. Yet she saw herself in ESG as that role started to evolve. What happened? Uh, she she was on leave, had her second child, came back. They said they were going to take her out of that role into a smaller role in finance. She left. 2 weeks later, she got three ESG offers. My point is that oftentimes people are in roles that they shouldn't be in, but they're there because that's what the organization said is in their best interest, meaning the individual, when they're really doing that for the betterment of the organization. And these individuals are saying, why am I in a role that I should no longer be in? I mean, yeah, one can wait like this individual and say, okay, I've been in it for 12 years. Now I've discovered something new. But shouldn't that be more on the organization to get out in front and say, look, I've seen how you've evolved now that we're more relational, more entrepreneurial. Hey, I need you out of finance. I need you in business development. Shouldn't that be the process?
Well, what you're talking about is going back to what Scott said in the very beginning of our conversation, right? That part of this idea of needing to connect and understand your employees is about really understanding who they want to be. What do they see their ideal self as, right? Too often in organizations, we have, through data analytics and other things, reduced people down to a series of bullet points off of a role and confine them within that role versus really asking them, who do they want to be in this life, in this world, in their professional lives? Where do they see themselves growing? What are the opportunities? And then looking as a leader, as a manager for those connection opportunities, right? So if I were going to keep with your example for a minute, right? If I were the manager of this person and I was engaging in this idea of entrepreneurial leadership, maybe I wouldn't move her right away out of finance. Maybe that's not right. Maybe I can't backfill her, but I would say, let's look at this idea of ESG. What's going on in the organization? Where could we engage you? Where could we bring your financial knowledge into those aspects of the conversation? Or what projects could we leverage you? How do we think more cross-functionally and bringing that together? So it's not necessarily always about, and I may not have the ability to say, you know what, I can take you out of a finance role
Mhm.
completely. Organizations are all managing on shorter staffs and those kinds of things, but how do I enable people to expand their job? How do I think about an idea we call job crafting? How do I think more expansively about who that person is, what they're bringing to the organization and what they want to do, and how do I facilitate those opportunities to happen? So maybe 70% of her job remains finance, but now she's got 30% that's ESG, and that sustains the part of the job that's less engaging. So it is being more creative. And that takes time. And I recognize in today's world, managers and leaders are short on time.
And
Yeah.
it calls back to Dana's point, it calls back what we were saying earlier, that the nature of the relationship matters. Because if I don't feel safe, if I don't feel that trusting, caring, empathetic relationship with the manager, I may not even share that I'm interested in ESG. and I may just keep that to myself and make decisions separately. I remember years ago, I was working at the Fortune 50, and they had the lead patent innovator in the company. Billions and billions of dollars were generated because of this gentleman's patents.
Hmm.
And I got a call from the head of HR saying, look, we want him to manage a team of people that can help grow the patent capability that he has clearly demonstrated. And he's refusing. Would you please meet with him? And I said, I'm happy to meet with him. I'll hear, but I'm not going to change him if he doesn't want to change. And they said, okay. I sat down with him. He said, look, I'm happy to develop people. I want more people to have this capability. I just don't want to be responsible for all the administrative work of managing a team. I don't want to do the performance reviews. I just want to develop their capability. So I called the head of HR and I explained this, and she goes, well, we don't have a box for that on the org chart. And I said, you're missing the point. You're going to lose this guy. He'll go elsewhere, and he was going to go elsewhere. Or you can create a box if you need a box to put him in a different box that doesn't exist because he wants to contribute to what you're trying to do, but you've got a very narrow way of how that needs to fit into an organizational chart. That's an example of where we have these old ways of leading and managing that are just not helpful to meeting the aspirations of the people and, frankly, the aspirations of the organization. I think generally people want to do good work. They want to contribute and help the organization. But if I'm treated like an object or a vehicle, I'm not going to offer what I really think and feel. And I'm certainly not going to bring out my best self in the long term.
Guys, this has been wonderful. I mean, and by the way, Dana, you've given us all a different perspective of what the outcome of connection, empathy, and aspiration can be. So thank you, because we don't often discuss what the potential outcomes of those behaviors are. We just say that we have to understand them and be that way and respect them. But I love where you took that. To kind of wrap things up, guys. I mean, you mentioned HR, Scott. Uh, where are these models presented? Is this a C-suite discussion? Is it an HR discussion? Is it a department head discussion? Is it a small business discussion? Where does where does the conversation start?
I don't think the conversation starts in HR, unfortunately. Like that's just really not. I think the conversation really starts in two places. Or maybe I would say three. One, it starts, it's certainly always at the senior leadership level, and I'll let Scott talk to that a little bit more because he does a lot more work in that particular sphere. It also really starts at the high potential level, right? Most organizations are doing training and development for their high potential employees, and those employees they really want to develop and grow and want to see grow into their strong leadership in that organization. And so if you're starting to develop and train those, how do you infuse these ideas into those individuals so that as they go back and start taking on more opportunities, they're starting to adjust their own leadership approach in this way? And then if you can't make systemic change, it starts in some skunk work possibility, right? Where some individual in their group that they're managing in their team, they see the opportunity of this and they start piloting it. And we know in those situations where that individual is successful and they're able to pursue new opportunities and they're able to engage in entrepreneurial efforts and they're seeing something different. Other people in the organization see something different in that team. They start to ask that manager, what's going on in your group? Why is that different? What's happening there? And the ideas can expand from there.
Yeah,
Scott?
and sometimes in the organization where you don't have that support, you have to do what Dan is talking about, but you have to do it in a way that's a little bit undercover. You're not breaking any policies or legal issues, but Deborah Meyerson years ago called them tempered radicals, where they get enough evidence of what they're doing that then the organization says, oh my gosh, something valuable is going on here. What is this? We don't understand it. But you may have to kind of do it in a skunk works way to just get that evidence built. I agree with those three that Dana mentioned. Back to the executives, I've long believed that a single CEO or C-suite team can affect some change, but not massive change. in the sense that's sustainable and generative. It's done in much more nuanced ways than just one single individual. But what they do influence very directly are the norms of the organization,
Hmm.
because the way in which they approach what they do gets transmitted and reverberates outward. And those norms, positive or negative, generative or degenerative, really influence the culture. So I've had leaders say, we want to change the culture of the organization. And my response is, are you willing to change?
Hmm.
Because really you are impacting the norms which drive the culture in a very direct way. And that's tough to swallow. Wait a minute, you mean I need to change? Well, wait a minute. Well, let's take a look at the norms that your behavior is setting and how it might be impacting the culture. So I do think there is some real ownership of the C-suite group, those senior leadership group, to take a serious look at themselves, how they're interacting in the micro ways and in the macro ways that influence the norms of the organization, which are driving the culture.
Well, Scott and Dana, thank you so much. I'd love to ask each of you to provide any final commentary or thoughts. Dana, can you start it?
Uh, My final commentary is usually don't be afraid of change, right? If we think about anything we do, I always go back to our personal lives, right? We all have activities that we're engaged in that we're trying to grow and develop and get better in. And we know that if we're going to do that, we have to leave behind old habits. It's the only way you get to sort of a more transformational place. And so for individuals not to be afraid, not to be held back by our traditional ways of doing things, and be willing to take a little bit of a risk and try this and try to work with their team differently and try to think about how they bring in and think bigger about their organization and the opportunities in front of them.
Excellent. Thank you, Dana. Scott?
I think we at Babson remain very optimistic. It's just the nature of where we work and who we work with. And I'm optimistic. Yes, we've talked about some really serious challenges that exist, and it seems like they're growing in number and in scale. But I'm optimistic for two reasons. One, because at the end of the day, we drive as human beings great value and um, strength in our relationships wherever we can find them, and those deep relationships matter. So, A, we know how to do this because we're doing it in those relationships that are generative and bring us joy. And second is that the incremental often leads to exponential. It's
Mhm.
extraordinary to me when I work with groups where they're just practicing active listening. And then I turn to the person who was being listened to and say, what was that like? And it's extraordinary when you feel like someone is really paying attention and listening. Such a small little act, but the exponential benefit of that is huge. So we've talked about some important shifts that need to happen in organizations, but a lot of these are incremental shifts that build over time. You can just start with the little, but it's going to have that exponential benefit. So that'd be my closing comment.
Well, and to kind of bring it all together, this is not about if it's going to happen. It's about when. And I can tell you, as you guys know, there isn't anybody here other than someone who just doesn't want to change that doesn't want this. They just don't believe that the institutions are ready for it. And it's no longer about the institution defining the individual. It's the individual defining the institution in search of a shared mission. This is inevitable. And what concerns me, as optimistic as I am, like you, Scott and Dana, is that we'll continue to wait until we see a real problem. And I've often been told, Glenn, you're in a business of people can't see what you do until there's a problem because that's when they need it. And we've reached a point now where it's crystal clear. It's not about, but so the question is, how and when do we get started? So I share this because both of you guys need to be out there and they need to be calling you because what you're bringing, even at an entry level conversation, is so valuable because in the end, the individual has been wanting this for years. And the numbers speak for themselves. My concern is if we don't get to this quickly, I think the financial repercussions are going to be tremendous. And we can't place a bet on AI alone because that's not a solution, that's a tool. And if we don't get people to understand who they are and allow them to be entrepreneurial and to build their confidence, then they're going to be using AI, and AI is going to strip that away from them even more than what it is, which means what? We've got a bigger challenge ahead of us. So I really appreciate the time that you guys have spent with me. This has been invaluable. I hope that people take this and they put together a big webinar and just hit the play button, just let everybody listen, because what you've provided everyone is a tremendous gift. And my hope is that they do something with it. So, Dana, Scott, thank you so much for being here. Let's stay in touch and greatly appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for the conversation.
As we end every show, when you lead in the age of personalization, you will see things that others don't. Do what others won't, and keep pushing when prudence says quit. Until next time, my new friends, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Personalization Outbreak. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss a show. If you enjoyed the content, visit ageofpersonalization.com to check out our free streaming video series and learn how to get involved in the movement. I'm Glenn Yopes. I wish you a good day, and remember, without strategy, change is merely substitution, not evolution.